professor and that I also actually practice law. And what I'd like to talk about mainly today is the new laws that are applied right now at the University of Colorado campuses. They're old laws from the perspective of all the other state institutions of higher education, but of course they're brand new this year at the University of Colorado, where licensed carry by law of handguns by law-abiding adults is now legal at the CU campuses. And the perspective I'd like to give is from the role I took in the case, which was heard in the Colorado Supreme Court, and before that in the Colorado Court of Appeals. In the Colorado Supreme Court, I wrote an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, not only for the Independence Institute, but jointly for the County Sheriffs of Colorado, the organization that represents all of Colorado's elected county sheriffs. It's probably appropriate that today we're talking about this on September 11th, the day of the anniversary of the terrible terrorist attacks against the United States, and as we continue to think about the consequences and what we need to do to respond to that. After September 11th, there was, of course, lots of energy from all kinds of people about, well, what are we going to do to prevent the next one or to stop it if it's in progress? A lot of civil liberties have been lost since September 11th, and the surveillance state that was already growing under the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations accelerated its growth. Thanks to the Patriot Act and to also many other actions of the George W. Bush administration. And despite whatever hope and change that people have been hoping for with a new president, the effect of President Obama's first term has been to essentially ratify and consolidate those civil liberties intrusions. So it is now the Obama administration taking the same position as the Bush administration often did, on positions such as saying, if you bring a portable computer across the border, we the government, have the right to search the entire contents and copy the entire contents of your hard disk. Just because you brought it over the border, not because we have any, as you were traveling from Vermont to Montreal to watch an Expos baseball game, that if they want to seize your computer and look at everything in it, they can. And of course, many, many other violations of civil liberties. But there are also things we can do to protect ourselves against terrorist attack which involve enhancing or expanding civil liberties. Some of those include strong protection of the First Amendment so that we have vigorous debate in the United States, which includes the ability to question what government officials do and when they're making mistakes or implementing policies which may not make us better off. And of course, our freedom of religion is another very important thing, because that means that, unlike in many other countries, people who want to be able to worship freely don't have to resort to violence to overthrow a government or attack law enforcement, that everybody has that freedom as a baseline. The right to keep and bear arms is another one of those freedoms which can sometimes provide protection against terrorist attacks. We saw those hideous attacks in Mumbai, India, a few years ago, and that illustrated rather clearly that when there is a well-coordinated, planned terrorist attack, sometimes the police don't get there in time, or the police may be underarmed, or for whatever reason, they are not, if they are the first responders, that first response comes far too late to save many dozens of innocent victims. In Israel, during the 1970s, the so-called Palestine Liberation Organization, one of really the founder of terrorism in the modern world under Yasser Arafat, was attacking schools in Israel and school buses, and a horrible massacre resulted from that. And following that, the Israeli government decided to change its policies and said, when we are going to have volunteer parents, grandparents, when our kids go on school bus trips, if we're going to take them down to the sea in a school bus, Grandpa's going to be coming along carrying his Uzi submachine gun, which he might have from his military service, or whatever firearm he might have. And there were a number, quickly thereafter, of terrorist attacks in which the terrorists were captured by armed Israeli civilians and complained quite indignantly that their terrorist bosses hadn't told them that Israeli citizens pervasively carried firearms. More recently in the West Bank, a number of attacks on schools have again been thwarted simply by law-abiding Israeli citizens having firearms to chase away or stop the terrorists. Now, terrorism doesn't always have to be something that has a strongly political or religious motive. The terrorism means that the crime is perpetrated for the purpose of causing terror. So if there was a robbery of a Radio Shack recently, and last Friday led to a hostage situation, although I'm sure the hostage who was held by them for 6 hours felt terrified during that experience, it wasn't an act of terrorism. The robbers wanted some money, and they perpetrated that crime in an attempt to get some money. And if you'd said, come to them on the way to the Radio Shack and said, well, if instead of, you're hoping to get $350 out of the cash drawer at the Radio Shack, how about if we just give you $500 and you go home? They would say, wow, that is a great deal. All we want is money. We didn't, we're not really there to cause any trouble other than to the extent that we need to get the money we want. And we have no ulterior purpose other than more money in our pocket. That wasn't terrorism. But when people perpetrate a crime for the purpose of spreading fear in a particular community or in a broader community, that certainly is terrorism. The Columbine High School attacks were absolutely an act of terrorism. The attacks on the Aurora movie theater were an act of terrorism. And generally speaking, so are attacks at schools in general. That they are not aimed simply at one person is mad at a former employer and so decides to take revenge on that person, but there's no broader implication. Almost always these attacks are intended to spread fear. The Colorado Supreme Court unanimously upheld the Concealed Carry Act of 2003, which provides for the licensing, a regularized system of licensing for people to carry concealed handguns throughout the state of Colorado, as the statute said. Here are the criteria. And these are the criteria that were created by the county sheriffs of Colorado. The Concealed Carry Act of 2003 is their bill. It had support from lots of other folks, the National Rifle Association, many other organizations and citizens, but the bill was written by them, it was based on their model, and they took their model from the policies that Larimer County Sheriff Jim Alderden had already been implementing in Larimer County for years. To obtain a permit, you first go to your sheriff's department and you go through a 10-point fingerprint-based background check, all 10 fingers, and those fingerprints get sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation as well as to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You have to pass a safety training class of a particular certified kind taught by a established national organization at firearm safety training. If you've done that, if you've passed the background check, you don't have disqualifying factors such as having a felony conviction, a domestic violence misdemeanor conviction, a restraining order against you, not being if you're an illegal alien, if you couldn't get one, dishonorably discharged from the military. All those factors would adjudicate an alcoholic, adjudicated mental health issues. All those would automatically disqualify a person from obtaining a permit. But in addition to that, there is something that is informally called the naked man rule. And this is something the sheriffs fought for very hard to make sure that it stayed in the legislation. And to do this, the sheriffs had to defeat the Rocky Mountain gun owners, a absolutist organization, which, unlike the National Rifle Association, I would say doesn't qualify as being within the general mainstream of views on firearms. But the sheriffs fought for and got the naked man provision, and I'll read it to you. It actually doesn't say anything about not having clothes on. But the sheriff has, even for the person who passes the background check and the safety training class, the sheriff has the discretion to deny a permit if the sheriff has a reasonable belief that documented previous behavior by the applicant makes it likely the applicant will present a danger to self or others. So the reason they call it the naked man is, well, maybe the sheriff knows that old Joe actually has, no criminal record, but he does sit on his lawn chair naked in front of his house screaming about the imminent Martian invasion. And so the sheriff has the authority to deny the permit to that man or to any other person for whom the sheriff has documented evidence of documented behavior showing the person would likely to be a danger to self or others. And then, of course, on top of this, remember that the people who are applying for a permit are by definition a subset of the most scrupulously law-abiding people. And why is that? It's because if you want to violate the law and not get caught, I'll give you two really easy crimes to do. First, you know that do not remove tag on the mattress at home? Close the blinds, rip it off. No one will notice. Now, if you want to be careful, dispose of that tag so that when people are, maybe somebody's like going through your garbage, they don't see that tag in there. But then burn the tag in your fireplace or rip it to shreds, and you'll get away with it guaranteed. And the other thing is illegally carrying a concealed handgun, because it's concealed after all. And if you were carrying it concealed properly, then nobody will notice that you're carrying it. Just don't walk through buildings that have metal detectors or where you're going to get stopped and frisked. But other than that, it's a very easy crime to get away with. So the kind of people who will apply for a permit are the ones who are so eager to comply with the law. The kinds who stop at the walk, don't walk sign even when there's no traffic because it says don't walk, and well, that means they're not supposed to walk, because they end up paying over $100 in fees, and then in fingerprint, a fee for the permit, a fee to be fingerprinted, and then whatever the cost of the training course is. On top of that, they probably spent over $200, and what do they get in exchange for that? A little card which says you can do something which you could have done anyway, and nobody would have ever noticed that you were doing it anyway. Carrying on campus is not a theoretical idea about what happens when that is done. In the litigation on this, the University of Colorado attorneys offered all sorts of hysterical scenarios about what would happen. And I guess the question that the CU attorneys never answered is exactly why are CU students so much worse than CSU students? Because when the Concealed Carry Act went into effect on July 1st, 2003, Colorado State University, which is in Larimer County, asked Sheriff Alderton, well, what do we do about this? And he said, here's what you should do, is you should let people who have the permits, which is probably is only a minority of undergraduates, because you have to be 21 to be issued a permit, let them carry on campus. I've talked to the head of campus safety at Colorado State. There has never been a problem, not one, by any person with a licensed carry permit at CSU. Likewise, in the April of 2010, the Colorado Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in this case, Students for Concealed Carry on Campus. And that case eventually went to the Colorado Supreme Court. But right after the Colorado Court of Appeals ruling, every other public university or college on Colorado came into compliance with the Concealed Carry Act. The one holdout was the University of Colorado, but everybody else, Adams State, Mesa State, on and on, all the other campuses immediately came into compliance. And so, again, we've never had any cases of problems resulting from this. At Utah, they have a similar law. And again, in all the public university and college campuses in Utah, there have never been problems with this subset of people, the hyper law-abiding, obtaining permits to carry firearms lawfully throughout the state. And let's remember, this is not, what is offered here is not something that says, well, when you get your student ID card here at CU Denver or CU Boulder, we'll also give you the opportunity to, for another $45 fee you pay to the student union, you can also get a card that says you can carry on campus, that you can carry, you can't carry in general in the state, but you can carry on campus. That's not the kind of situation at all. Everybody who was allowed to carry on campus, licensed carry on campus, is someone whom state law already says is licensed to carry throughout the state of Colorado. So the students carrying and faculty and staff carrying at CU today are people whom the legislature has already said we have a safe procedure to screen them so that these people are carrying when they're walking down Colfax Avenue, when they're driving down I-70, when they're going to McDonald's, when they're going every place in the state that is public property, because of course private property owners can exclude anybody they want under any conditions, almost. So these are people who are already carrying throughout the state. It doesn't seem to me that they become dangerous, nor did it seem to the Colorado State Legislature that they would suddenly become dangerous when they set foot on their university campus. If they're already carrying safely everywhere else in the state, then I don't think there's any bad karma at the CU Boulder or Denver campuses which turns law-abiding people dangerous. We have a lot of data about how law-abiding these people are from other states. Let me just give you some rundowns about licensed carry, because now Colorado is like 40 other states. The norm in the United States is these licensed carry laws. Not to say that anybody can carry a gun, but to say we're going to have fair and objective procedures for law-abiding adults who pass safety training classes and stringent background checks to be able to carry. And we have, these laws are now so common that we have a lot of data from other states about the behavior of this. And it is, I will admit to you right off, that compared to cloistered nuns in a convent, licensed carry permittees are not as law-abiding as that group. But you compare it to just about any other large group in American society, and permittees are highly law-abiding compared to almost anyone else, partly because it's A, the self-selected group of people who just wanted the card to do what they could get away with anyway, and B, they are all people who passed the fingerprint-based background checks, so they're not somebody who has arrest and conviction records. Let me just give you the data. In Minnesota, the data showed that there was one handgun crime committed for every 1,423 permittees, if you define handgun crime broadly, such as if you had a handgun in the car and then you were driving under the influence of alcohol, that would count as if you count that as a handgun crime, then it's the rate of one crime for 1,423 permittees. In Michigan, in the 2-year period of 2007 to 2008, there was a population of 190,000 permittees, and there were 161 charges of misdeeds involving handguns out of that group of 190,000, and some of those were duplicate charges or things that didn't result in a conviction. In Ohio, they've had 142,000 licensees since 2004, and of those, 637 have been revoked for any reason, including that the permittee moved out of state. In Louisiana, the permittee gun misuse rate is less than 1 in 1,000. The Texas data showed that handgun licensees post-licensing are 79% less likely to be convicted of any crime, littering on up, than the non-licensee population. Only 0.2% of licensees are ever convicted of any violent crime or of any crime violating any sort of firearms regulation. And in Florida, we have a rate of 27 firearms crimes per 100,000 licensed Florida residents, much lower than almost any other comparable group in the country. Now, of course, the answer that some people give to this is, well, yeah, but students are a bunch of drunks, And besides that, CU students in particular, well, they're high all the time anyway. But of course, that's based on stereotypes and prejudice. The law, the drinking age in Colorado, as it is nationally, is 21. That's also the age at which a person can be issued a concealed carry permit in Colorado. So if you're 19 years old and hanging out and drink until you throw up and then kind of relieved that you throw up because that means your stomach settled down so you can drink some more, you can't get a concealed carry permit anyway. If you're over 21 and you go to the University of Colorado, then you're exactly like everybody else in the state who is over 21, who does or does not go to the University of Colorado, which is you could potentially be issued a carry permit, and you can legally buy and consume alcohol. Long-standing Colorado state law says you may not possess a firearm while intoxicated. Now, possess here means possess in an immediate sense. It doesn't mean that if you went down to the a local micro brew place and got really drunk and you owned a gun back home, that you're violating the law in that regard. But if you were carrying a gun while you were intoxicated, that would be a violation of state law. And that would be a violation of state law whether you're a college student, a graduate student, or anybody else. It's the same law that applies everywhere to everyone. In Colorado, we know that this Concealed Carry Act has saved lives and has prevented at least one case, what would have been a terrible massacre. In December 2008, a evildoer murdered 2 people at churches in Denver. He then drove down to Colorado Springs to the New Life megachurch there. He murdered 2 people in the parking lot and then walked into the church with firearms and a huge supply of ammunition. The New Life megachurch is truly mega. There were 7,000 people in the sanctuary that day. Because of this life-saving law that the county sheriffs of Colorado fought for successfully, Jeannie Assam, a church volunteer, was carrying a licensed handgun for protection that day, to protect as a volunteer security guard at the church. She confronted the attacker and she shot him and stopped the attack, and then the attacker killed himself. According to Pastor Boyd there, she probably saved 100 lives that day. We do know that armed opposition to armed criminals stops them, because of course that's just common sense. When you have a active shooter, as the police terminology calls it, the first thing that everybody wants to do is say, well, there's a bad guy with a gun who's attacking people. What do we want? What's the immediate thing to do? Well, we're not going to try and re-educate him and try and talk him into being peaceful. We need, the immediate solution to this is a good guy with a gun. And that's why you call the police, because they have guns and they will come right away. And in what they've learned post-Columbine, they will not try to surround the area. They will go in immediately and take action at the risk of their own lives to confront that active shooter. But the police, of course, can't be everywhere all the time. But a broadly armed citizenry can be. We know that a school shooting was stopped in Pearl, Mississippi in 1997 because the vice principal at a junior high school ran to his car, retrieved a handgun, put the gun to the killer's head, and the killer immediately surrendered. The killer at Appalachian Law School in 2002 was apprehended partly because of 2 law students who retrieved their handguns from their automobiles. An attack at a school dance in Edenboro, Pennsylvania in 1997 was ended by a restaurateur who used his shotgun. Now, there's no guarantee that calling the police or having armed citizens around guarantees that the attack will end immediately, but it certainly improves the odds of an outcome that has fewer innocent lives lost. One of the most, I think, unfair arguments made by the CU lawyers against licensed carry on campus, as in everywhere else in the state, was that somehow it would be a threat to academic freedom. You know, CU was established in 1870, sorry. The University of Colorado was established by our 1876 state constitution. It's the only university that is in our constitution by name. And from 1876 until 1970, there was no policy at all against people carrying firearms or having firearms on campus. If you lived in a dorm and you went hunting from time to time, you could have your hunting rifle in the dorm. Or if you carried a gun for protection under whatever the appropriate laws of the state were at the time, you could do that as well. But right before 1970, there was another high level of terrorist attacks in our country. Campus riots, violence, a lot of it incited by terrorist organizations such as the Weather Underground and the Black Panthers. At Colorado State, there was a student strike against the Vietnam War was in progress, and the Old Main building, which is the Old Main, capital, proper name, which is the centerpiece of the university, was destroyed by an arsonist who was never apprehended. Other arsonists attempted to burn down the ROTC firing range. And then a few weeks after that arson of CSU's main building, that's when the University of Colorado regents adopted their first significant restrictions about firearms on campus. And at the same time, the Board of Regents also hired 2 former FBI agents to root out communists on campus. Now, of course, it's proper for any university to prevent terrorists or other criminals of any sort from being on campus. But then in 1994, CU went even further and adopted the policy which ultimately was found inapplicable or found to be superseded by the Concealed Carry Act for people who have permits. In 1994, sort of at the height of the gun control movement in the United States, the regents adopted a policy which asserted that firearms possession on campus, in fact, interferes with academic freedom. But of course, nobody in this litigation, the Students for Concealed Carry on Campus versus Regents, nobody ever pointed to a single instance in which anyone's academic freedom had ever been violated or threatened by someone carrying a lawful firearm. Not at CU, not at CSU, not anywhere in the state of Colorado, not anywhere in the state of Utah, not at any other campus in the United States which has licensed carry. Never, nowhere. You know, there was speculation that apparently, well, maybe we were having a big discussion about Antigone, and it can be a very emotional play, and so what if somebody pulls out a gun during that? Well, again, I think a century and a half of experience of CU's existence shows that CU students are a little bit better, are much better than that. Or likewise, when they're debating Keynesianism in economics class and there's heated opinions on all sides, well, the students so far haven't been pulling guns on each other. And you know what? All of those students who were having those heated debates on Keynes or Antigone or whatever else, even though they couldn't have lawfully carried a gun last year or the year before that, they all came into class with their fists. They had weapons they could use against each other. Now, if you had a situation where fist fights frequently broke out in Philosophy 101, there might be some argument. Well, let's not have guns around this kind of situation. But students who have their own natural weapons in class don't use them against each other because of heated debates on issues of academic interest. The 1994 Regent policy went on to say that the presence of firearms threatens the tranquility of the educational environment and contributes in an offensive manner to an unacceptable climate of violence. And so the policy said that firearms should be banned because the university educational mission should attempt to teach and model those values which are held to be important to the nation as a whole. Now, having litigated a bunch of constitutional cases, including up to the U.S. Supreme Court a couple times, this is one of the rare things where you're litigating against a government entity, the regents, and they've actually declared that they don't like the Constitution. Usually when people or governments are acting against the Constitution, they say, well, we while firmly believing in the First Amendment freedom of speech, we're imposing these following censorship rules, but we think that's completely consistent with the First Amendment, and we love freedom of speech and freedom of the press. But here, the regents actually went out of their way to say how much they disliked constitutional values. The Constitution of the United States of America and of the state of Colorado guarantee the right to keep and bear arms. The state constitution doesn't have any militia complication in it. It says the right of no person to keep and bear arms in defense of home, person, and property, or in aid of the civil power when thereto legally summoned, shall be called into question. But nothing herein shall be construed to justify the practice of carrying concealed weapons. So under our state constitution, open carry is the constitutional right, whereas concealed carry is something that can be regulated by the legislature. But yet the regents, in their total ban against all forms of guns in all conditions, said how that the values which are held to be important for them were banning guns, were teaching and modeling that people don't have guns. That's like banning religion on campus and saying nobody can pray or distribute religious literature or talk about religion because the values we hold to be important are the opposite of that. Well, that's fine if you have a private religious, if you have a private atheist university, and that's going to be your student code of conduct. But if you're a public university in a state and nation where the free exercise of religion is guaranteed and is one of the most important values, that's why it's guaranteed in the Constitution, then you can't have a public university adopt and impose with threat of expulsion just the opposite kinds of values. There is no legitimate government interest in suppressing the exercise of constitutional rights, and nor is there a legitimate interest of the regents in preventing people who are licensed by their sheriffs after thorough background checks and safety training to carry firearms throughout the state of Colorado be prevented from protecting themselves at the university, not only in the cases of a fortunately very rare type of terrorist attack, but also just in the more day-to-day situations of people in parking lots, walking around the streets, going home to an apartment late at night. People in our state have the right, constitutional right, to defend themselves, and thanks to the Colorado Supreme Court, that right has been vindicated, even at the University of Colorado. Thank you. Now let's open it up for questions and arguments or anything else. Yes.
The question I have is, what are your thoughts with regard to the regents wanting to have separate dorms for concealed carry permit holders versus? I mean, I understand that there are those that don't want to live in a dorm where they know there's guns, but I know a lot of people that would say, hey, I'd rather live in a dorm where I know it's going to be safe.
Well, and they can. And I'd say as a practical matter, that's not of the highest importance. Of course, this is a commuter campus. Nobody's living in the basement here. Even at the Boulder campus, it's only freshmen who have guaranteed student housing. And of course, freshmen, the vast majority are under 21, so they wouldn't have a licensed carry permit anyway. I think I'm not sure what the legal result on that will be, but I would say if they had done that, if the regents had done that from the start, or for that matter, done it after the Colorado Court of Appeals ruled, instead of being so recalcitrant and saying not only are we not going to obey what the Colorado Court of Appeals just said, but we're going to take this to the Colorado Supreme Court. If they'd done that dorm policy to begin with, I think most people would have accepted that. Yes?
Hi, David. First of all, I accept your position. I got a couple of questions.
Yes.
What you presented. Okay, I mean this honestly. First of all, I didn't realize, was the woman at the church a volunteer security guard, did you say?
Yes, Jeannie Assaf.
Then doesn't it render this really irrelevant, because nothing in this decision would prevent a church from hiring a security guard if they wanted to, and the fact that she was there in an official capacity distinguishes it from just a parishioner.
Oh, no, she was, I should be clear, she was not a licensed security guard. She was not a security professional. She wasn't somebody no, she was not. She was a regular Colorado citizen who was being a licensed, she was only a security guard in the sense you could call me a voluntary University of Colorado lecturer today. I don't have any official position at CU. I'm not.
But you are fulfilling that role, as was she.
Exactly.
Whether or not, I think that's what he's getting at.
Yeah.
The role that she was filling that day was as a security guard. Whether or not she's licensed in that capacity or whatever, they had instituted a policy of having volunteer security guards should something go wrong. So she wasn't solely in a capacity of being a Colorado citizen who was sitting in the pews and listening to the sermon. She was there in the capacity of someone who would prevent violence to the parishioners should that event occur, and that kind of
exactly.
It's tangential to the point that it is beneficial for ordinary citizens to be carrying.
The only reason she, as an ordinary citizen, could do that volunteer job at the church on the same day that other people, church volunteers, were doing the job of handing out programs or escorting people to their seats, was because of the Concealed Carry Act. It's because of that she could lawfully carry the firearm at the church and do so. And so she had the ability to volunteer in that way, and had it been 20 years before, it would have been illegal for her to volunteer in that way.
Okay, the second part of the question, and again, this is, again, I'm an academic, so I'm going to act. You mentioned a context where people with concealed carries prevented further violence. Are there known instances, because the counter-argument is that these people can also escalate the violence. So for example, the Aurora shooting, and I think you were quoted as saying, if somebody in the audience had been carrying a gun. Well, we don't know whether anybody in the audience was carrying a gun and was smart enough not to get involved, because this guy had full body armor on, and that may have made the situation worse. And so do we know of any instances where that has actually occurred? Somebody with a concealed carry tried to intervene and made the situation worse?
No, in terms of these, sort of highly publicized, mass homicide attacks on strangers, we don't know of a situation like that, and it is, as you say, it is theoretically possible. But of course, having police officers with firearms has the same risk. So a few weeks ago, there was a guy who went to the Empire State Building, to one of the decks, and he was mad because he'd recently gotten fired, and so he shot his former supervisor or some kind of authority in the company. So you had one guy who went and killed one person, and obviously did it in a public place at the deck. 2 police officers arrive. One New York City police officer shoots the bad guy and stops him. The other New York City police officer misses the bad guy and hits 8 innocent people.
And highly trained professionals. So we're saying
exactly. Well, he's not.
Is that really what you're getting at?
I'm saying New York City Police Department officers are not highly trained professionals. This gets to a bigger point. New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg is the daddy warbucks of the gun ban movement in this country. And what happened at the Empire State Building shows the dysfunction that his attempt to suppress gun ownership in general causes. Police officers who I represent at the Supreme Court twice and in the United States Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit in a case currently pending, I represented the 2 organizations which train the police in firearms. The International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association and the International Association of Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors. Their belief, which they told me and I represented at the Supreme Court and the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals, is that a strong culture of civilian firearms ownership is a very important foundation for successful police firearms ownership and use. Whether it is the guy who comes to the police academy, where in the several weeks in the police academy he's only going to have several days to be taught about guns, and it is a thriving culture of where you have shooting ranges all over, where it is common for people to go target shooting for practice. That's the environment, like we have in most of the United States, where law enforcement officers go and practice on their own and get the proficiency because they're part of the gun. They too are part of that gun culture we have in the United States, where you go and you use guns for fun and you go with your friends and practice with them. And in New York City, where they have worked so hard to suppress and constrict and destroy that gun culture, that is one of the important causes for the incompetence of the second officer at the Empire State Building. The nice thing about, as we explain, the police training organizations is citizens who are protecting themselves don't have to do some of the most complicated things that police officers do. If you're a police officer and you get a call on a domestic violence situation, you're going into somebody's house, you don't know anybody there, you don't know if there's an ambush set up, and you have no idea who's the perpetrator, who's the attacker, you have whatever information you got from the 911, and you may have to make a very rapid decision about whether to use force in a complicated situation. Likewise, whenever you're a police officer intervening in a crime, sometimes it's very obvious who's the victim and who's not, but not always necessarily. You may be getting into seeing a brawl in front of a 7-Eleven. In contrast, the much more typical citizen self-defense case is quite obvious. I'm in the parking garage, I'm a 70-year-old woman, there are 3 big guys coming at me and surrounding me, and one of them just pulled out a knife. Oh, I think I know who the good guys and the bad guys are in this situation. You have a much less, and you also are quite likely to be at such close range that the threat of the firearm is in itself sufficient to deter.
You are using 2 different examples that purposefully illustrate the point. As though there's always, I mean, yes, in the case of police, they are responding to highly complex situations, of course. And they need to be trained in the procedures that should be implemented before they use firearms. In the case of citizens, it's not always the 70-year-old grandma in a parking garage with 3 big guys. A lot of the time, I mean, if we look at the theater shootings in Aurora, it is a chaotic circumstance where it's dark, you don't really know what's going on, and if somebody decides to be the hero and pull out their gun, they could very well make the same mistakes that our police officers in New York made and hit the wrong people. You're dealing with 100 people in a movie theater.
Well, in the Aurora movie theater, the guy who has a Joker mask on and has carrying 4 guns and is shooting at other people, he's the bad guy, and all the people are running away from him.
But you've got adrenaline pumping through you like nothing, and you have no idea what's going on around you. You are simply acting on instinct at that point with a gun in your hand.
Let me from the police.
So is that you have to go through such extensive training, and in Douglas County alone, you are required serious accuracy, and you are told, people who own guns, you practice all the time, you load your gun in the dark while you're laying in bed. I mean, you're constantly preparing yourself for different situations.
Beyond your target. So, I mean, I've heard so many arguments, and if I had mine, I could have stopped it. No, you can't say that until you were there. No armchair quarterback can do that, right? But when you shoot a weapon, the first thing you need to know is what's beyond your target. And those that have concealed carry, I mean, I hear them say that's the first thing that they pay attention to. So
of course it is, but what I'm saying is that being on a shooting range, learning the processes and all that, it does make you more comfortable with the weapon. Of course it does. And it makes you more comfortable.
I don't mean to step on you, but a lot of shooters train with adrenaline. When I go to the range and I'm like, okay, this is a self-defense day, I'm not just doing target practice. I do push-ups, sit-ups, and I run a quarter mile before I pick up my weapon. So my hands are shaking by the time I'm there. And if I cannot put all my shots on target in an acceptable grouping, I do it again. I keep training with adrenaline. That's the shooters. That's what shooters do.
Is that standard practice?
I don't know if it's standard practice, but that's what I would say.
Well, and we
could have adrenaline spiking my blood.
May I say something?
let me get to you just one sec, but just in the, you can conjecture all you want and talk about hypotheticals. We've had licensed carry on a broad basis in this country for 25 years. We've had 4 massacres, including the one in Colorado Springs, stopped in part because of it. We've never had the counter scenario hypothetical, which you talk about. And I will say, even in a situation of chaos, the police officer coming into that confronts the same chaos. He has to make that kind of decision too. A shooter, an active shooter who is being shot at is going to be highly distracted. You'll find very few things in life distract your attention more from what you're doing than somebody shooting at you. And you can take the worst, most incompetent defender in that hypothetical Aurora movie theater, and you have him shooting in the general direction of the killer. That is going to greatly degrade the killer's accuracy and give more victims more time to escape it. Sir, you've been waiting a good while. Thanks.
I just want to disclose, my name is Don Transu. I've done a lot of research in the last 12 years on gun laws. I've done lobbying for gun rights. I come from Illinois. I just moved from Chicago 3 weeks ago. The only state in the country where I can't carry a gun. I also run a website that describes mass shootings in America, and they all have one thing in common. They're all gun-free zones. That's the point we're missing here. The places with the highest gun control has the highest per capita violent crime, rapes. Chicago has so much rape, they won't even disclose to the federal government the rape rate. That's how much rape Chicago has. It's the biggest city with the most gun control. And if you look at my website at gunmap.org, you'll see, I haven't listed all of them, but most massacres are on here, and they're all gun-free zones. The point of these big massacres is, we can't get lost in the minutiae. If you can shoot here, if it's dark, you are right about that stuff. That stuff happens. People shoot, even if they're law-abiding citizens, and people will probably get hurt. But the point is, when someone's crazy, when someone's going to do something really whacked out, they want to go to the path of least resistance. And when a movie theater has a policy to turn your guns in your car and go in, those guys go, you know what, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to get the most bang for my buck. So that's my first point about gun control. The second point about gun control is a little dirty secret we have in this country that nobody wants to talk about. All these gun laws in this country are based on the color of people's skin.
Well, that's a separate topic, and that's,
okay. If you go to my website, gunmap.org, you will look at that.
I mean, I can see your map, but you're missing correlation.
Wait, well, let's give some other folks a chance to talk.
I've studied correlation and causation for 15 years on gun control.
The man in the pink shirt.
Disagree.
Let's broaden it.
That example you were talking about, people suppressing active shooters. In 1966, Charles Lipping climbed the 27th floor of the University of Texas clock tower. He was up there for 96 minutes, and all of his victims were shot in the first 20 minutes. That was because students grabbed their deer rifles and held him down until police could get there.
Thank you for mentioning that. The Texas Tower Massacre of 1966 was one of the most shocking things in American history. And it was one, for those of us who were around then, it was really one of those key things where you felt like the country was spinning out of control. Yes, ma'am.
So you started out talking about terrorism and how we're, in a lot of ways, living in a state of heightened fear. And so that example of the woman in the parking garage and somebody attacking with a knife, it could also be somebody walking by that for some reason happens to look scary, and a lot of people are already having that heightened sense of fear and fear of an attack. And if they happen to have a gun, are going to be much more likely to use it. I mean, the U.S. has
sure. No, I get your point.
Higher rates of gun deaths than anywhere else than the developed world, and much higher rates of gun ownership. So I just feel like in an already heightened state of fear, putting that many more guns into people's hands isn't going to make gun crimes less than make us any safer.
Right, and I think that is a reasonable question. And so when Florida became in 1987 the state that started this modern trend towards this liberal trend of liberalizing concealed carry laws, that was exactly the kind of question that people were asking. And because we at the time only had half a dozen states with fair and objective laws on licensed carry. And so nobody knew what would happen in a big, dense state, for sure what would happen in a big, dense state like Florida. The answer is in some of these statistics that I cited before, and the answer is in 41 states. That I wouldn't say you were wrong to raise that hypothetical before it happened, but we now have a quarter century of experience, and that doesn't happen. Or if it does, it happens quite rarely, that it is not a widespread problem, that in fact that subset of the population that gets the licensed carry permit, they don't cause problems. Just as it's an empirical question, and we have an empirical answer. Yes?
And I have a question, or a response to you, sir. When you made the comment about that those of us with concealed carry, that it could just escalate the violence, I was one of the students named the lawsuit against the Board of Regents. So, and I worked at the Anschutz campus at the time the Supreme Court decision came down. And I had people, you know, oh, now you can carry, and I'm like, you know, what would happen if they were starting to do what if something happened on the Anschutz campus? And my response to the chair of my department and to my HR people was, I would not be the one that's out there with guns blazing trying to go get the bad guy. My primary responsibility, because I hold myself to a higher standard because of my concealed carry, is to take all my coworkers and people, get them away from the doors, get them safe, and hope that the person that comes to the door has a badge or yells police, because I will shoot them, but it's not a matter of going out and being gunslinger and they'll take her out.
Okay. And sir, wait, let's get one more question, then we should wrap it up because it is getting to be 1:30. Yes, sir.
So isn't there element of surprise that might have given edge to people with concealed carry over when comparing to the officers also?
In criminology, you have two kinds of deterrence. And one is specific deterrence where, oh, I'm afraid to commit a crime against that kind of person, that particular person. And so if a person were carrying openly, that's called specific deterrence. On the other hand, if you have general deterrence is society-wide. As it turns out, in states like Colorado with licensed carry, you might have 0.5%, 1%, 4%, 7% of the eligible population eventually gets a permit. So that means when you say if you're a criminal who's thinking about attacking the Cherry Creek Mall, and you say, well, there's going to be 500 people there, you don't know which of those 500 have a gun, but in a statistical sense, you know it's pretty likely that some of them will. That provides the general deterrence. So in fact, we have now another separate problem in economics called the free rider problem, because only a small percentage of the population goes to the expense and trouble of getting the permit and carrying, and they provide general social benefits to the 97% of others who don't. So we haven't figured out exactly the solution to how to tax that 97% who don't have carry permits, but that will be perhaps dealt with in the future. Just kidding on that. We don't really want to tax people without carry permits. Thank you anyway. I'd be happy to just hang out and talk with folks who have questions afterwards. Thank you.